We just got done modeling some rocks and coral to help populate our fairly sparse looking crab world. So let's start placing all of these objects by using some of the powerful placement tools in Cinema 4D. Okay, so we're not going to do just the boring thing of like just using the move tool and manually placing these objects, because there's a way cooler and easier way to do that type of thing. And what we're going to use instead of the move tool is the placement tools, and they're aptly named. They help you place objects along a surface, any surface in your scene. So where are our placement tools? They're right here. We got a place tool and then a dynamic place tool, which we'll get to a little bit later on. But if we go and activate the place tool, you can see here are our place tool options. And by default, it's going to use the bounding box as the reference point to help place this along a surface. So if I click here, you can see this bounding box. It's those blue corners. And if I click and move over this fishbowl, you can see that we're placing this object along the surface of the fishbowl, which is really, really cool. Now, of course, we don't want to place this on the fishbowl. We want to place this on the sand. So what we're going to do is I'm going to twirl down the fishbowl elements, and I'm going to click and hold on this topmost cloth object here and click and paint downwards. And that's going to turn off the cloth object, the lathe, and the spline. So now we can freely move this coral and place this right along the surface of our sand, which is really, really cool. We can even place this on the crab if we wanted to, holding a coral baton, why not? And this is really awesome because now we can scale, we can rotate this, we can place this, and you'll see that this is kind of, again, aligning to the surface of our sand. And if we go to reference point, what it's doing is it's using this bounding box shape to place this object. Now there's also this axis option, which if I hit E to go to my move tool, you can see my axis centers right here. Let's just say we wanted to move this up just to demonstrate here. I'm going to go to my axis modification mode. So this is going to allow us to change the axis center on our object. And if we just move that up and then get out of axis modification mode, now you can see I'm back into my move tool. I can move my object, but that's where my axis center is. Now, if I want to go back to my place tool, I'm going to go to this previously used tools widget. I can do that, or I can hit the space bar to toggle between my current tool and my previous tool. So toggling between the live selection and the place tool. And now if I go and use axis, you can see that now this is kind of using the axis center as the reference point of where this is going to be placed on a surface. Okay, now we don't necessarily want that, so I'll switch this back to bounding box. Let's just say we didn't want this to align to the polygon surface. So if I hit N and then B to get in my garage shading with lines, you can see that our current orientation is normal. And normal is basically a 3D term that tells you the direction in which a polygon is facing, the polygon normal direction. So the polygon direction for, say, this polygon right here, if I just, let's grab my doodle tool here. So this polygon is actually facing out this way. So that's the polygon normal direction. Now I just doodled there. I'm going to go and delete that doodle object that was created. And let's go back to my placement tool. And so that's basically what a normal is. And it's using the normal of our polygons to orientate the object that we have here. So let's hit NA to get back to our garage shading with outlines. And what if we wanted to just maintain the original orientation of our object as it is orientated right here? If we don't have it placed on an object just standing upright, what we can do is say, you know what, orientation, let's keep the current orientation. And now when I click and move this over, you can see that this isn't aligning to polygon normals anymore. It is just keeping and maintaining that upright orientation. Now next up is the up direction. And this is basically the direction in which this object's going to be aligned to as we're placing this. So right now, the up direction is positive Y, which if I hit the E key to get back my axis arrows, you can see this is positive Y. If I go back to my place tool here, if we adjust this to say X, you can see this is kind of laying flat. If I change this to Z, you can see this is still kind of off. Negative Y, this will just kind of be upside down here. Okay, so let's just go back to positive y there. And let's just say we wanted to maybe not have this kind of float so much. What if we wanted to have this bottom of this coral intersect our sand a little bit? That's where this offset comes in. So the offset is this x, y, and z offset. So if I bring the y to say -6 or so, and then click and drag, you can see now our coral is being placed with a little bit of that negative y offset. So we have a little bit of intersection here. So it looks like our coral is now, planted in the sand. Okay. Now, another cool feature is this prevent collision. So you see if I move this around, it's going to intersect, say, our crab here. If we turn on this prevent collision, we can actually have this prevent us from intersecting any geometry. And then again, it's using this bounding box as that guide of what is the form of this shape and trying to prevent it from intersecting other objects in the scene. We'll just turn that off for now, and let's just place this coral in a nice spot here. So maybe something like this. Move this back, scale this up. So maybe something like that. And now let's grab this other coral here, still in my place tool, and maybe we shrink that down using the scale. We'll rotate this back here. And you might need to move some of these seaweed bits back. So maybe we can do that. Let's select this piece, maybe move this back, maybe select multiple pieces here and move this back. And you'll see when I selected all of those objects and started to move them, they're moving opposite directions. And that's because if I hit the E key to get the move tool, you'll see that positive Z is facing this direction for this object, and then positive Z is facing this way for this object. And when I select multiple objects and I say I want to move them along this positive Z is different from each of these objects. So instead of using the local axes of each of these individual objects, what I can do is use the world axis. So using the world coordinate system here. So -Z is always facing this direction in the world system. And to do that, I'm going to go over to this coordinate system button. And instead of using the object coordinate system, I'm going to use world. And now I'm moving all of these objects along the positive Z in world coordinate space. Okay, so it's not using the individual object space anymore. You can see all the Z axes are facing the right direction. The moment I click this button again and go to object coordinate system, you can see those axes flip. So pay attention here. I'll toggle this on and off so you can see how that works. So sometimes when you're placing multiple objects, you might want to go into your world coordinate system, move some stuff around, and then just get out of that world system again, go back to your local coordinates and kind of adjust things there as well. So I would say this is giving us a little bit more room to start placing some of our coral. Let's go back into our place tool here and maybe scale this up, rotate, and then we got one last coral here. Let's kind of move this, scale this down a little bit. Let's move this back. Now maybe for this one, we'll use the normal orientation so we can have this kind of angle a little bit. And you can see that the axis center, if I go and hit the E key, the axis center is actually off from this object. So you can see if we wanted to use the axis versus the bounding box, because even the bounding box we're kind of angled at this weird direction. The center's not here. It's right here. You can see that little circle, that blue circle there. So what we could do is we can use that reference point of the axis, but if I hit the E key, we need to actually edit that axis and move that more towards the bottom of our object. So to do that, I'm going to enable axis modification mode and then just move this to align it more towards the bottom of that coral. And then make sure I remember to get out of that axis modification mode. And now if we go back to the place tool, now you can see this is kind of aligning along this area here versus in the bounding box mode, we're pivoting right here, kind of off axis. So this is kind of handy to have that. And maybe we get rid of that offset a little bit and place that right there. Now, what if we wanted to duplicate this? Well, we can quickly do that. You can see there's this clone mode. And when you clone an object, you can either create an instance of it, which is basically just like a proxy version that always references the original object. a render instance version of it, which is basically an instance, but it's more optimized to save RAM. And then there's just simply to copy that object, okay? And typically I'll like to use this copy because then I can individually edit that individual duplicate that we make. So clone mode, copy, I'll control or command click and drag, and maybe we move this over here. Maybe we even move this behind, do something like that. And then maybe we get this coral here, command or control click and drag, and move this up to the front. Maybe we adjust that offset a little bit so this is sinking a little bit more. That's a little bit too sunken, but maybe a little something like this. Scale this up a little bit. But I think this is looking good. We're kind of layering these elements in here, and got to remember to reset this offset here if we select other objects. And this is still using that axis, so let's use the bounding box. So depending on which object you select, again, we're using this, this normal orientation. Let's do keep. And you can see this is actually keeping the orientation that I was in on this normal direction. So if I go to keep, you can see it's actually going to keep this angled direction, which I don't want. So I'll go back to normal. Let's have this facing a little bit more upright, and then go back to keep. And this will keep this current orientation like that. And once you get to a certain point where you're like, okay, this looks good enough, just go and hit E to get the move tool, and then just, edit this with a fine-tune control there, okay? So that is our move tool. Let's go ahead and start placing some of our rocks now. Now, instead of using the simple place tools, what we can do is use the dynamic place tool. And the dynamic place tool is really cool. It allows you to place objects using physics, okay? So if we activate the dynamic place tool, you're gonna see all of this kind of pink bounding boxes happen. And what's happening is the dynamic system is kind of taking over and taking stock of all the objects and all the object bounding boxes in the scene. And if I go, you can see we have a different widget here. We have the rotation widget. We have individual scales. We have this purple scale, which if I select multiple objects here by holding the shift key down and adding to my selection, you can see as I'm moving these axis scales, and especially this purple one, which kind of brings all the axes in, I'm clustering and using dynamics and physics to collide these rocks together. And I can rotate these around using the rotational bands. You can see our axis arrows here as well. But this is super cool. Now watch what happens when I bring all of these rocks over to this area here. We're now having all of these rocks. Let me cluster these objects together. So I'm going to grab this purple handle and shrink that down. And now we have this cluster of rocks that's now kind of just using physics to collapse down and get placed onto our crab and onto our sand. So this is super, super cool. Another cool thing is we can move these up. And if I wanted these to dynamically just fall, what I can do is hold the shift key down and just click and drag, and you'll see these objects just kind of fall until I take my finger off the shift key, and that will stop the dynamic simulation. So you can see that we're using dynamics to place these objects using the dynamic place tool, which is really cool. So let's go and move these rocks over to the side. Let me just select one, and let me get the move tool just to shrink these rocks down a little bit here. Maybe grab the placement tool and just kind of place these. You can see that we have too much intersection, so let's get rid of that offset. I'm just going to right click on that arrow to reset to default. And you can see what's going on. It looks like our object's kind of flipped, and I think this is because our y-axis is a little flipped on this rock. So let's use the up direction of -y, and now, yep, there we go, that fixed it. And there we go, we can adjust the size here. Let's grab this rock, and you can see that for this rock we actually need to flip back to the other y direction here. Let's use normal as the orientation as well. So this is kind of adjusting to the surface here. Looking good. Let's get our last rock here. And let's kind of move this into place, scale this down, rotate this. And once we're happy with, the general scale of these rocks, we can go into our dynamic place tool and just kind of tumble these around and have these be put in a position that they would naturally rest as an object, which is pretty pretty awesome that we're able to do this kind of thing. So maybe place this object here. So super cool using all these placement tools here. Maybe hit the E key to shrink this one down. Let's go back to our dynamic place tool and just kind of have this roll around like that. And it's just a natural resting position for our object. Now let's move this coral out of the way. And this is just so much fun to be able to manipulate objects like this. Now, what if I wanted to create a lot more rocks, like little tiny pebbles, but I didn't want to, command, click, and drag and duplicate all of this stuff manually? Well, that's where another placement tool comes in, and that tool is called the scatter placement tool. So if you wanted to scatter a whole bunch of objects, this is a tool. This is what you want. So if I grab this scatter placement tool here, what it's going to do is it's going to scatter whatever objects that you have selected. That's the mode that we're in now. Now you can select individual objects that you want to kind of clone by dragging and dropping them into this little area here. So if I wanted to drag in all 3 types of this rock in there, I could do that, or I can just go by selection. So if I wanted to scatter all 3 types of this rock, I just have to simply select them. And then at this point, if I click and drag, this is going to just be like a paintbrush that's going to paint on these rocks onto the surface of these objects here. Now, if I go back to my scatter pen, bring up the options, you can see we have a radius, and you can see this is basically giving a little bit of personal space to these rocks as they're getting scattered. And then the object spacing, if I remove this, you can see we're having more objects populated in those tiny white circles there. The bigger I make this, the less there will be. And then we have splat spacing, which the splats are those white circles, and the spacing is just how far those splat circles are from one another. So the smaller this is, the more clustered those objects can get. The bigger the spacing, the more spread out those rocks will be. Now, if we adjust this count, this is basically how many of these rocks, how many of these objects are going to be inside of each splat area. And so there's just a lot of fine-tuned control here. I can paint some more. And if we want to edit any of this stuff, what I'm going to do is go to my move tool by hitting the E key. And then we have this scatter object here. And if I try to grab one of these rocks, you'll see I won't be able to. Now, if I go and select my scatter object and check on edit mode, I can individually select any of these objects here and edit them. So I can go back to my placement tool and edit any of these, okay, which is really, really awesome. And just get a lot of fine-tuned control. And like that, I have a ton of these little tiny pebbles all over the place. Now, if I wanted to start out with tiny pebbles, of course, I could go and select all these rocks, duplicate them, and you can see that as I move them, they all have different axis centers here. So let's go to that world coordinate system, move this off to the side, and let's just shrink these down. So now we got tiny pebbles. And if we select all of these, let's actually rename all of these objects from rock to pebble. And to do that, I'm going to go to the basic tab, and this is where we can rename our objects aside from just double clicking on them in our object manager here. I'm going to click here and type in pebbles and hit enter. And now you'll see that pebbles will be the name of all of these 3 objects here. So now I can select those 3 pebble objects, go back to my scatter pen here, and just click and drag. And like that, we now have a ton of these little pebbles on the floor of our sand. Now, of course, I have some pebbles here that are just kind of floating that were painted on top of previous rocks there. So what I can do is hit E for my move tool, click on the scatter object, go to the object tab, click on edit mode, and I can even delete some of these objects here that are kind of like floating here. Now, one last thing I'll show is maybe we want all of these scattered pebbles. Let's just rename this pebbles to be dynamically placed and kind of fall into our scene. Well, you would think to do that, you would just go to your dynamic placement tool and you select all the objects that are within this pebble object here and just move this up. And you can see that this pebble object, and you can see that scatter pin is treating all these pebbles as a single object, okay? And we don't want that. We actually want each of these little pebbles to be their own object, not this big group and cluster. So to do that, we're going to need to basically make this object editable, just like we collapse down our rocks with the volume builder and stuff like that. If I hit the C key to make editable, or click this make editable button here, you can see now we have a bunch of instances of our rocks. Now, instances, if I move this up, they again are proxies referencing those original pebble objects that we have right here. Now, what I can do with all these objects as separate pieces, I can turn back on my fishbowl, and with the dynamic place tool still selected, I can hold the shift key down, click and drag, and these will all fall onto our object and stay within the fishbowl here. Now, some kind of fell along the sides there. Let's maybe move this up. Let's cluster these together by using that purple scale axis. And let's move this way above here, way above the lip of our fishbowl. If we hold the shift key down and click and drag, and you'll see all of this stuff fall. Now, something that might happen in your scene is if I go and try to move these out, you'll see that my objects are kind of stuck in this fishbowl. I can't move them out. Why is that? Well, if I go to my collider geometry, turn on visualize colliders, you're going to see all of the collision geometry that is being calculated in the background to prevent objects from colliding into one another. And you can see that the top of this fishbowl is just kind of sealed off. And that's because we don't have enough accuracy in our calculation here to recognize this concave hole here, okay? So to fix that, I'm just going to up the accuracy, which is going to up the accuracy of the dynamic collision. And if I go up to an accuracy of 8, you can now see this is not sealed off anymore. It's now recognizing that this is a concave hole, and now I can move this up outside of the fishbowl here through that hole. And now I'll turn off the visualize colliders because we don't need it anymore. And now I can again hold the shift key down and click and drag, and this will just have all of our pebbles kind of fall in the back there. And again, whenever you release the shift key is when that dynamic simulation stops. And there you go. We have all of this stuff here. Now we still have these floaty rocks right here that we can go and just kind of place. And if you don't even want to place them, we can actually just hide them within the sand here. Because again, these are being referenced in all of our scattered, dynamically scattered instance objects here. So if I were to just say like, you know what, I don't want these pebbles floating out there, I'm going to delete them. You're going to see that deletes all the other pebbles because those pebble instances were referencing those pieces of geometry. So I'm going to Command or Control Z to undo that. You can see that our instances went red, but now they're green again. So we don't want to delete them. We don't necessarily need them shown in our scene. So we can just hide them in our geometry. So they're being referenced, but not actually being used in our scene aside from in their instance form. So now what you can do is, play around with the dynamics placement tool, get all of your pebbles in a nice position using either the dynamic placement tools or the normal placement tools, and just kind of, populate the sand floor of your crab's home here. So dynamic placement tools, a lot of fun to play around with. So go ahead, populate your own crab bowl, and don't make him look like he's a hoarder or he's just a very messy person. Let's just, keep it enough, but, not too much stuff. We don't want junk everywhere, okay? See you in the next video.